Chicago is a city of broad shoulders, but on this freezing November night, it turned a cold indifferent back to the suffering hidden in its shadows. Under the rusted skeleton of a railway viaduct, the wind didn't just blow. It screamed, carrying a sleet that stung like needles. The ground was a slushy graveyard of industrial waste, mud and frozen puddles, vibrating every few minutes with the thunder of trains passing overhead. In this concrete tomb, surrounded by the deafening noise of the Fay city, a tragedy was unfolding in absolute silence. The invisible villain here wasn't just the hypothermia creeping into the bones of the living, it was the cruel apathy of thousands of commuters who had passed by this spot, too busy to look down at the pile of wet trash that was actually a dying family. Hidden behind a mound of rotting pallets lay Goldie, a golden retriever whose once lustrous coat was now a matted, soaking mess of mud and grease. She was curled into a tight ball on a piece of dissolving cardboard, shivering so violently that her teeth chattered with a sound like dry bones clicking together. Her ribs protruded sharply against her skin, a grim map of starvation that told the story of weeks without a proper meal. But Goldie wasn't shivering for herself. Tucked desperately against her underbelly were 4 puppies, no more than 10 days old, blind lumps of fur crying out for a warmth their mother could no longer provide. She was a living shield, absorbing the freezing rain to buy them a few more hours of life. The horror of their situation was magnified by the remnants of a plastic storage bin lying shattered next to them. Someone, a monster in human skin, had sealed this family inside that box and tossed them from a moving car like garbage. Goldie, driven by the hysterical strength of motherhood, had clawed her way out, tearing the plastic with bleeding paws to give her babies air. Now, exhausted and defeated, she lay there with a look of profound resignation. Her amber eyes were glazed over, staring into the darkness not with anger, but with a heartbreaking plea to the universe. She was making her peace with God, ready to die, begging only that an angel might swoop down to save the tiny lives trembling against her chest. Enter Elias, a 60-year-old ghost in the machine of the metropolis. Once a proud construction worker who helped build the city's skyline, a series of misfortunes had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rusted shopping cart containing his worldly possessions. He walked with a limp, his joints aching from the damp cold, his face weathered like old leather. Elias wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for a dry corner to survive the night. In his pocket sat a treasure, half a cheese sandwich given to him by a sympathetic tourist hours earlier. It was his only source of calories, the only thing standing between him and the gnawing pain of an empty stomach. As Elias pushed his rattling cart under the viaduct, seeking shelter from the biting sleet, a sound cut through the cacophony of the storm. It wasn't the screech of metal or the roar of wind. It was a soft, rhythmic mewling, weak and desperate. Elias froze, tilting his head. Most would have ignored it, assuming it was a rat or just the wind playing tricks, but Elias had a heart that hadn't hardened along with his luck. He pulled a small, flickering flashlight from his coat, batteries dying, light dim, and swept the beam across the debris. The light caught 2 amber reflections in the gloom. Eyes, sad, pleading eyes that locked onto his with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. Elias abandoned his cart and stepped into the mud, the cold water soaking instantly through his worn-out boots. As the beam of light fully revealed Goldie, he gasped, his breath forming a cloud of horror. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered, his voice cracking. He saw the emaciated frame, the blood on her paws, and the tiny pile of puppies. Goldie didn't growl. She didn't bark. She didn't have the energy for aggression. She simply lifted her head an inch, her tail giving a single, pathetic thump against the wet cardboard, a greeting of pure, unadulterated hope from a creature that had every reason to hate humanity. The old man knelt, disregarding the filth, his knees sinking into the slush. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his precious half sandwich. His own stomach roared in protest, but he broke off a chunk of the bread and cheese, offering it to the starving mother. What happened next would haunt Elias for the rest of his days. Goldie sniffed the food, her nose twitching with hunger, but instead of eating it, she used her nose to gently nudge the piece of bread toward the pile of puppies. She looked up at Elias, her eyes brimming with tears, as if saying, "Not me. Save them. Please, just save them. This moment breaks my heart. She is starving, but still puts her babies first. If you are crying right now, please subscribe and pray for this mother. Let's see if Elias can perform a miracle tonight. Elias felt a lump form in his throat the size of a stone. He had seen cruelty on the streets, but he had never seen love like this. He realized with a sinking heart that the sandwich was useless for the puppies. They needed milk, and the mother was too dehydrated to produce any. The abstract villain of time was ticking loudly. The puppies were growing quieter, their movements slowing down as the cold shut down their tiny systems. The temperature was dropping, turning the rain into ice. If they stayed here for another hour, the morning train would pass over a frozen tomb. The obstacle was immense. Elias had no car to rush them to a vet. He had no phone to call animal control. He had no money for a taxi. He was miles from the nearest shelter, and even if he got there, most shelters would turn him away with 5 dogs. He looked at his shopping cart, then at the dying family. He looked at his own coat, a heavy, wool-lined parka that was the only thing keeping him from freezing to death himself. A crazy, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. It was a decision that defied logic, a choice that only a man with nothing left to lose could make. He knew that to save them, he would have to expose himself to the lethal elements. He would have to become their shield. The wind howled louder, mocking his hesitation, but Elias looked into Goldie's trusting eyes and found a strength he thought he had lost years ago. He wasn't just a homeless man anymore. Tonight, he was their only hope. But he didn't know that the storm was about to get worse, and the journey he was about to undertake would test the limits of human endurance. Elias stood in the freezing slush, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the gravity of his decision settled upon him. The wind was biting, tearing through the thin layers of his remaining clothes, but he looked down at the shivering pile of fur and knew there was no other way. With trembling hands, he unzipped his heavy, wool-lined parka, the only barrier standing between him and the lethal Chicago winter. As he peeled it off, the cold hit him like a physical blow, a shockwave of ice that made his teeth clatter instantly. He was now exposed, wearing only a threadbare flannel shirt that offered as much protection as a paper napkin against a hurricane. He took the coat, still holding the faint warmth of his body, and laid it carefully inside the rusted wire basket of his shopping cart. It transformed the cold metal cage into a makeshift nest, a soft haven amidst the steel and grime. He turned back to Goldie, whose eyes followed his every move with a mix of confusion and awe. "It's all right, Mama. We're going to a better place," Elias chattered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. He reached down to lift the puppies first, handling them like fragile glass figurines. One by one, he placed the tiny, mewling bundles onto the wool lining, their cries quieting instantly as they sank into the warmth. Then came the hardest part. Goldie tried to stand, her legs trembling violently, but she collapsed back into the mud, too weak to support her own skeletal frame. Elias groaned, bending his aching back to scoop her up. She was lighter than she should have been, a bag of bones wrapped in wet fur, but to a man exhausted and freezing, she felt like lead. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the screaming protest of his arthritic shoulders, and lifted her into the cart. She curled around her babies immediately, letting out a long, shuddering sigh as the wool trapped her body heat. She looked up at Elias, and for a fleeting second, her tail waged, a tiny movement that fueled the old man's resolve. Elias grabbed the handle of the cart, his knuckles turning white. The wheels were wonky, one of them stuck in a perpetual wobble that fought him with every step. He pushed off, leaving the shelter of the viaduct, and stepping directly into the teeth of the storm. The transition was brutal. The rain had turned into a heavy, wet snow that plastered his hair to his skull and soaked his shirt within seconds. The wind howled down the alleyway, pushing against him like an invisible hand trying to shove him back. "Just keep moving, Elias. Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, a mantra of survival. The journey was a nightmare of endurance. The slush on the sidewalk was deep, clogging the small wheels of the cart, forcing Elias to shove with his entire body. Wait to make progress. His boots, full of holes, were soaked through, his toes numb and devoid of feeling. Every block felt like a mile. Cars whizzed by on the adjacent street, spraying dirty grey water onto the sidewalk, but Elias positioned his body to shield the cart. He took the freezing spray on his back, shivering so hard that the cart rattled in his grip. He was a human shield, absorbing the cruelty of the city so the innocents inside wouldn't have to. Blocks turned into miles. Elias's vision began to blur, the streetlights smearing into long streaks of hazy yellow. His chest burned with every inhalation of the icy air, a deep, rattling cough seizing his lungs. He stumbled over a crack in the pavement, nearly tipping the cart over. Panic surged through him, adrenaline giving him a momentary burst of strength to right the ship. Goldie lifted her head, whining softly, sensing his distress. She licked the wire mesh of the cart near his hand. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. She was telling him she was still with him, that they were in this fight together. But the invisible villain of hypothermia was closing in fast. Elias could no longer feel his ears or his fingers. His thoughts were becoming sluggish, a dangerous sign that his body was shutting down to preserve his core organs. He knew he needed shelter now, or he would be found frozen on the sidewalk come morning. Through the driving snow he saw it, a small, humble church with a glowing cross above the door. It was the St. Jude's Parish, a place he had passed 1,000 times but never entered. It looked like a beacon of warmth in a world of ice. He pushed the cart toward the light, his legs feeling like heavy logs. The final stretch was an uphill battle against a snow-covered ramp. Elias slipped, his knees slamming into the concrete, but he didn't let go of the handle. He crawled, pushing the cart inch by inch, fueled by a desperation that transcended physical limits. He finally reached the heavy oak doors, panting, his heart fluttering wildly in his chest. He parked the cart under the small overhang, shielding it from the falling snow. With hands that felt like blocks of wood, Elias reached for the brass handle and pulled. Locked. The realization hit him like a hammer. It was late. The church was closed for the night. He pulled again, harder, rattling the doors in a frenzy. "No! No, please!" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at the cart. The puppies were silent, and Goldie's eyes were closing. The warmth of the coat wouldn't last forever, and Elias had nothing left to give. The cold was seeping into his very soul. Despair washed over him, blacker than the night sky. He slumped against the doorframe, sliding down until he hit the cold stone step. He had failed. He had brought them this far only to die on the doorstep of salvation. Tears froze on his cheeks. He looked up at the closed door, raising a shaking fist to the wood. He didn't have the strength to shout, so he knocked a weak rhythmic thudding. It was the sound of a man at the end of his rope. "Open up," he sobbed, his forehead resting against the wood. "I don't care about me. Just take them. Please, God, just take them." He pounded again, harder this time, the sound echoing hollowly in the empty street. The wind screamed around the corner, threatening to blow out the tiny flame of life remaining in the cart. Elias closed his eyes, his energy spent, and began to pray. Not for a warm bed, but for a miracle. He was ready to freeze right there on the porch if it meant someone would find the dogs in the morning. But they didn't have until morning. They had minutes. He gave up everything, even his coat, and now the door is locked. This is the moment of truth. If you are praying for that door to open, please smash that like button right now. Let's manifest a miracle for Elias and Goldie. Just as Elias's consciousness began to drift into the white void of hypothermia, the heavy oak door groaned. The sound of a deadbolt sliding back echoed like a gunshot in the silent street. A slice of golden, warm light cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the frozen tableau on the steps. Father Thomas, a young priest with a kind face and eyes weary from late-night study, peered out expecting to find a lost parishioner or a draft causing the noise. Instead, he looked down to see a man turning blue, huddled over a shopping cart like a guardian gargoyle. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" the priest gasped, abandoning all decorum as he rushed out into the blizzard, grabbing Elias by his frozen shoulders. "Help! Them!" Elias rasped, his lips barely moving, his finger pointing stiffly toward the bundle of wool in the cart. He tried to stand, but his legs were useless, dead weight beneath him. Father Thomas didn't ask questions. Adrenaline surging, he grabbed the front of the cart with one hand and wrapped his other arm around Elias's waist. With a grunt of exertion, he hauled both the man and his precious cargo over the threshold, kicking the heavy door shut against the howling wind. The silence of the sanctuary descended instantly, replaced by the hissing of steam radiators and the smell of beeswax and old wood. Inside the warmth of the vestibule, the reality of the situation was unveiled. Father Thomas helped Elias slide to the floor near the heater, then turned his attention to the cart. He peeled back the frozen, wet parka Elias had sacrificed. The smell of wet dog, sickness, and rain filled the small space. There, huddled together, were Goldie and her pups. The mother didn't move. She was limp, her breathing shallow and raspy, a terrifying sound that signaled fluid in the lungs. The puppies were silent, their energy spent, their tiny bodies cool to the touch. The priest's face went pale. He realized this wasn't just a shelter mission. It was a medical emergency. "Don't worry about me," Elias stuttered, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. Refusing the blanket the priest tried to wrap around him. "Save the mama, she's all they got." Father Thomas nodded, pulling out his cell phone with trembling hands. He dialed Dr. Sarah, a veterinarian who volunteered at the church's soup kitchen. "Sarah, get here now, it's life or death," he said, his voice tight. He ran to the parish kitchen, returning with warm towels and a bottle of corn syrup, knowing he had to spike the puppies' blood sugar immediately if they were to survive the hour. The next 20 minutes were a blur of frantic triage. Father Thomas rubbed the puppies vigorously with the warm towels, trying to stimulate their circulation. Elias, despite his own dangerous condition, crawled over to Goldie. He took a small amount of the syrup on his finger and rubbed it on her pale gums. "Come on, Goldie. You didn't come this far to quit," he whispered, his tears dripping onto her matted fur. She lay there like a rag doll, her eyes rolled back, her body unresponsive to his touch. The warmth of the room was helping, but the damage from the exposure was deep. The abstract villain was now pneumonia, and it was tightening its grip on her exhausted lungs. This is the critical moment. The vet is on the way, but Goldie is fading fast. Are you rooting for this angel? Your like helps save more lives. Subscribe to support our mission. Now, let's see if she survives. The church doors flew open again, admitting a gust of wind, and Dr. Sarah, clutching her medical bag. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She dropped to her knees beside the cart, her stethoscope instantly pressed to Goldie's chest. Her expression darkened with every second that passed. "Her lungs are full of fluid, and her heart rate is dangerously erratic," she announced, her voice clipped and professional. "She's in septic shock. The infection from the birth, combined with the starvation and the cold. She's crashing, Thomas." Elias felt his heart stop. "Do something," he pleaded, grabbing the vet's sleeve with his numb hand. "Please, she gave them everything. She gave them her heat." Dr. Sarah looked at the homeless man, seeing the sacrifice he had made, shivering in a thin shirt so the dogs could have his coat. That act of love seemed to steel her resolve. "I'm not giving up on her," she vowed. She pulled out a syringe and a vial of adrenaline. She injected it directly into Goldie's thigh, then set up a portable IV drip, hanging the bag from the coat rack. It was a makeshift ER in the hallway of a house of God. The crisis reached its peak in the dead of the night. Goldie began to seize, her body arching in a spasm of pain as her system fought the shock. The puppies, sensing their mother's distress, began to cry, a weak, collective mewling that broke the silence. Elias scooped them up, tucking them inside his own shirt against his skin, sharing his own recovering body heat with them. He sat cross-legged on the floor, rocking back and forth, whispering, a prayer that was more of a conversation with the Almighty. "You take me if you have to," he bargained. "I've lived my life. Let her raise her babies. That's a fair trade." Dr. Sarah worked tirelessly, administering antibiotics and manually compressing Goldie's chest when her breathing faltered. It was a war of attrition. Every time it seemed like Goldie was slipping away, the vet pulled her back. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Father Thomas paced the hallway, praying the rosary, while Elias kept his eyes locked on Goldie's face, willing her to breathe. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the longest night of their lives. It was a standoff between the cruelty of the world and the stubbornness of love. Then, just as the first grey light of dawn began to stain the stained glass windows, the miracle happened. Goldie took a deep, shuddering breath, not a gasp of pain, but a breath of life. Her eyelids fluttered, the chaotic rhythm of her heart on. The portable monitor steadied into a slow, strong beat. Dr. Sarah sat back on her heels, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for hours. "She's turning the corner," she whispered, a tired smile breaking across her face. "She's staying with us." Elias leaned forward, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. Goldie slowly lifted her head, her movements heavy and drugged but intentional. She didn't look at the vet. She didn't look at the priest. She turned her head directly toward Elias. She let out a soft whine and stretched her neck, licking the salt from the tears on his hand. It was a gesture of profound recognition. She knew he had walked through hell for her. She knew he had frozen for her. In that touch, a bond was sealed that was stronger than steel. The puppies, warmed by Elias's body and fed with formula by the priest, were sleeping soundly. The danger had passed. The storm outside had broken, leaving a city covered in white silence. But inside, the church, a fire of hope had been kindled. Elias stroked Goldie's head, feeling the warmth return to her ears. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the remaining crumbs of his sandwich, the one he had tried to share hours ago. He offered a small piece to her. This time she didn't push it away. She ate it gently from his fingers, her eyes never leaving his face. Dr. Sarah stood up, packing her bag, but leaving the IVs in place. "She needs rest, warmth, and a lot of food," she instructed. Looking at the priest, "She can't go back to the street. Neither of them can." Father Thomas looked at Elias, who was still on the floor, cradling the dogs as if they were made of gold. "They won't," the priest promised. "We have a warm room in the back. They're home now." The crisis had forged a family out of strangers. The homeless man who had nothing had given everything, and in return, he had saved a universe. As Goldie rested her head on Elias's knee and closed her eyes in a peaceful sleep, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a beam of light directly onto the little group huddled in the hallway. It was a tableau of redemption. The rescue was complete, but the story of their new life was just beginning. Who abandoned this angel deserves no forgiveness, but look at God's work. She survived the impossible. If you are crying happy tears, type Amen in the comments to bless her recovery. Don't forget to subscribe to see her incredible transformation in the next part. Winter in Chicago eventually surrendered, its icy grip melting away to reveal the tender green shoots of spring. But inside the grounds of St. Jude's Parish, a far more spectacular transformation had taken place, a resurrection that no one could have predicted. 3 months had passed since that harrowing night under the viaduct, and if you walked past the church garden today, you wouldn't recognize the cast of characters. The grey, hopeless atmosphere of the streets had been replaced by the vibrant colors of blooming tulips and the sound of pure, chaotic joy. Goldie was no longer the shivering, skeletal creature who had prepared to die in a cardboard box. She had undergone the ultimate glow-up. Thanks to weeks of high-calorie meals, vitamins, and Dr. Sarah's expertise, she had regained every ounce of her strength. Her coat, once a matted disaster of mud and grease, was now a flowing river of silk that shimmered like 24-karat gold in the sunlight. She moved with a regal grace, her head held high, trotting through the grass with the confidence of a queen who knows she owns the castle. When she smiled, and yes, dogs smile, it was a blinding display of happiness that could melt the hardest heart. And the puppies. They were no longer silent, dying lumps. They were 4 furry tornadoes of destruction and delight. Now robust, chunky, and overflowing with energy, they spent their days terrorizing the butterflies in the garden and wrestling in piles of fresh mulch. They were a living testament to the resilience of life. Every bark, every clumsy tumble, every playful growl was a victory over the death sentence they had been given. They were the church squad, the unofficial mascots of the parish, greeting every visitor with wagging tails and sloppy kisses. But the most profound transformation wasn't the dogs, it was Elias. The man who had pushed a shopping cart through a blizzard with holes in his boots was gone. In his place stood the newly appointed caretaker of St. Jude's. The viral story of his sacrifice had swept through the community like wildfire. Donations had poured in from around the world, not just for the dogs, but for the hero who saved them. With the funds, the church had renovated the small, unused cottage at the back of the property. Elias had a home. He had a warm bed, a uniform, a steady paycheck, and for the first time in years, he had his dignity back. One sunny afternoon, Elias sat on the steps of his cottage, a grooming brush in hand. Goldie sat between his legs, closing her eyes in sheer ecstasy as he brushed her thick coat. The bond between them had evolved into something telepathic. She was never more than 5 feet away from him. When he worked in the garden, she lay in the shade watching him. When he unlocked the church doors in the morning, She was his security detail. She wasn't just a pet. She was his soulmate, the witness to his redemption. As he brushed her, he talked to her, his voice no longer raspy with cold, but strong and clear. "Look at you, girl. You're the prettiest lady in Chicago," he chuckled. The puppies, now old enough to be adopted, had found loving homes with families in the congregation, but they came back every single day for daycare while their owners worked. The churchyard had become a sanctuary of joy. The scene was picture perfect. Elias throwing a tennis ball, his laughter mixing with the excited barking of 5 healthy dogs. It was a stark contrast to the silence of the viaduct. The darkness had tried to swallow them, but their light had burned brighter. As for the invisible villain, the monster who taped them in a box and threw them away, their punishment was their own miserable existence. They would never know the love that Elias felt. They would never know the loyalty of a dog like Goldie. While that person likely lived in the shadows of their own cruelty, Elias was living in the sun. The karma was instant and poetic. The person who threw away trash had actually thrown away a treasure, and Elias, the man with nothing, had picked it up and become the richest man in the world. The final scene of our story finds Elias sitting on a garden bench as the sun sets, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He isn't cold, he isn't hungry, he is at peace. Goldie jumps up beside him, resting her heavy head on his shoulder. He wraps an arm around her, burying his face in her warm, clean fur. The 4 puppies lie at his feet, exhausted from a day of play, a pile of wool. Sleeping innocence. Elias looks at the camera, his eyes crinkling with a genuine smile. He saved them, but looking at his new life, it is undeniably clear. They were the ones who rescued him. They say that God works in mysterious ways, sometimes using a storm, a shopping cart, and a homeless man to show the world what love really looks like. Under the viaduct, they found death waiting. In each other, they found life. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a destiny fulfilled. The storm has passed, and the forecast for the rest of their lives is nothing but sunshine. Who abandoned this angel deserves punishment, but look at her now. She is living proof that love heals all wounds. Question: do you think the driver who hit her will ever find peace? Tell us in the comments. Please leave a like if you believe every dog deserves a second chance, and comment Amen to bless Goldie, the puppies, and Elias in their new life. Don't forget to share this story to inspire others.